They signed away their rights to me when I was 13, for nothing. No money, no hesitation, just a signature that erased me from their lives. And 15 years later, they walked into a law office expecting to claim millions from the man who raised me, completely unaware that I was the one who legally owned everything they came for. My name is Sophie Bennett. I'm 28 years old, and I grew up in a working-class household where stability mattered, but control mattered even more. My parents weren't cruel in obvious ways. They didn't yell all the time or make dramatic scenes. Instead, everything in our home was quiet, structured, and decided long before I ever had a chance to question it, and from a young age, I understood that there were expectations attached to each of us. My older sister was the one who needed support, the one who was seen as having potential that required investment, while I was the one who was expected to adapt, to be flexible, to solve problems on my own without creating new ones. And over time, that expectation became my identity, not because I chose it, but because it was the only role that seemed available to me. At first, the differences were subtle, things that could easily be explained away if you didn't look too closely, like the way conversations about the future were framed. When my sister talked about college, there were discussions about savings, about applications, about how the family would make it work. But when I brought up similar ideas, the tone shifted. It became about practicality, about how I was resourceful enough to find my own way, how I didn't need the same kind of support because I was good at figuring things out. And while that sounded like a compliment, it carried a different meaning over time. It meant there would be no plan set aside for me, no resources waiting, no safety net if things didn't go the way I hoped. One of the clearest examples came when I was 12 and discovered that my sister had a college fund that had been growing for years, small deposits made consistently, quietly building something that would support her future. And when I asked my parents why I didn't have one, the answer wasn't emotional, it wasn't defensive, it was simple. They said that my sister needed it more, that she required stability to succeed, while I had already proven that I could handle uncertainty. And in that moment, I realized something important. The system in our house wasn't based on fairness, it was based on perception. And once you were placed in a role, everything else adjusted to support that role, regardless of what you actually needed. That pattern extended into everyday decisions, opportunities that came up at school, programs, competitions, activities that required time or money, and each time, the same logic applied. If there was a choice to be made, I was the one expected to step back, to give space, to allow my sister to move forward without competition. And it was always framed as something positive, as if my willingness to sacrifice was a strength, as if it made me more mature, more capable. And for a while, I accepted that. I told myself that it meant I was different in a good way, that I didn't need the same kind of attention or investment to succeed. But the longer it continued, the clearer it became that independence wasn't something I had earned. It was something that had been assigned to me because it was convenient, because it allowed the family to focus resources in one direction without having to question the imbalance. And even when I succeeded on my own, even when I found ways to create opportunities without their help, it didn't change how they saw me. It only reinforced their belief that I didn't need anything from them in the first place. By the time I was 13, I had stopped expecting things to be different. I didn't ask for support anymore. I didn't bring up plans that required their involvement. I focused on what I could control, what I could build on my own. And from the outside, it probably looked like I was doing well, like I was adapting exactly the way they had always said I could. But internally, something had shifted. Not into anger, not yet, but into awareness. An understanding that the life I was living inside that house wasn't designed for me to grow. It was designed for me to make space for someone else. The moment everything changed started with a letter I almost didn't open right away. It arrived in a plain envelope, with my name printed neatly across the front. And when I finally sat down at the kitchen table and read it, I had to go over it twice to make sure I understood. I had been accepted into a 6-week STEM academy with a full scholarship worth $4,200, covering everything from tuition to housing to materials. And for the first time in my life, something had been offered to me that didn't depend on anyone else's decision. It was based entirely on what I had done, what I had earned, and, for a few hours, I allowed myself to believe that this could be different, that maybe this would be the thing that shifted how my parents saw me. That belief lasted exactly one evening. At dinner, my mother listened as I explained the program, the opportunity, the fact that it wouldn't cost them anything, and when I finished, she didn't react the way I expected. She didn't ask questions or show curiosity. She simply nodded, and then explained that my sister had been accepted into a performing arts camp in California that would cost $1,800. And because of that, I would need to decline my scholarship. Her reasoning was calm, almost practical. She said the family couldn't focus on 2 programs at once, that my sister's opportunity aligned better with her future, and that I would understand because I was the one who always adapted. I remember sitting there, looking at her, trying to process what she was actually asking, not just the words, but the assumption behind them, that something I had earned could be redirected without question, that my role in the family was to make space whenever it was needed, and for the first time, I said no, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. I told her that I wanted to go, that I had earned it, that it was mine, and the silence that followed felt different from anything I had experienced before. It wasn't confusion or surprise. It was tension, as if something had just shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. What I didn't understand at that moment was that the decision had already been made. This wasn't a discussion about resources. It wasn't about what the family could or couldn't afford. It was about priority, about where they had already decided their investment would go, and my refusal didn't change that. It only disrupted the way they expected things to work, and the look my mother gave me made that clear. It wasn't anger in the usual sense. It was something colder, more resolved, as if she had just confirmed something she already believed about me. She leaned back slightly and said, in a voice that was calm but final, "If you can't sacrifice for this family, then you're not family." And the words landed in a way that felt heavier than anything she had said before, not because they were loud, but because they were precise. And for a second, I thought it was just another attempt to pressure me, another way to push me into agreeing, but there was something in her tone that suggested this was more than that, something that went beyond the moment. 3 days later, I came home to find my belongings packed into 2 black garbage bags sitting on the front porch. My mother was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression neutral, almost detached, as if she had already completed whatever she needed to do. And when I asked what was happening, she didn't explain, she didn't justify it. She simply told me that I would be staying with my uncle from now on, that it would be better for everyone. And as I stood there, trying to understand how the conversation from 3 nights ago had led to this, I realized that this hadn't been a reaction, it had been a plan. The door behind her stayed open just long enough for me to see inside. My father in the hallway, avoiding eye contact. My sister watching from the stairs without saying a word. And then it closed, leaving me outside with everything I owned reduced to 2 bags and no clear understanding of what came next. But that wasn't the worst part. The next few days made it clear that what had happened wasn't temporary. It wasn't a moment of anger that would be reconsidered once things calmed down. It was a complete and deliberate removal. My calls stopped going through, messages stayed unanswered, and when I tried to log into shared accounts or check anything connected to home, access had already been cut off, as if someone had gone through and closed every door at once, not leaving a single path back. I reached out to friends, people I thought would at least listen, But the responses I got felt different from what I expected, shorter, more cautious, and when I finally spoke to one of them directly, I realized why. They had already heard a version of what happened, one where I had refused to support my family, where I had created conflict over something small, where I had chosen to leave instead of working things out, and even though no one said it directly, I could hear the doubt in their voices, the way they were trying to reconcile what they knew about me with what they had been told, and that hesitation created distance that hadn't existed before. As the days passed, fragments of that narrative started to reach me more clearly. I heard that I was selfish, that I had betrayed my family over money, that I couldn't be trusted when things didn't go my way, and each version was slightly different, but they all pointed to the same conclusion, that I was the one who had caused the situation. And the more it spread, the harder it became to challenge, because I wasn't just responding to one accusation, I was trying to counter a story that had already been accepted by people who weren't there. What made it worse was the silence from my parents, not just the absence of communication, but the absence of any attempt to correct what was being said, and over time, that silence started to feel intentional, as if allowing that narrative to exist served a purpose, as if it justified what they had done by making it seem necessary. And in that space, I began to understand that this wasn't just about removing me physically, it was about redefining me in a way that made their decision easier to accept. The full extent of that decision didn't become clear until much later. At the time, I thought I had simply been sent away, that there might still be some connection left, something that could be repaired or revisited. But behind everything that had happened, there was another step that no one told me about, something that had already been completed before I even left the porch. My parents had signed a legal document transferring full guardianship of me to my uncle, not temporarily, not conditionally, but completely, removing themselves from any responsibility or authority over me going forward. I didn't know it then, but that document changed everything. It meant that what they had done wasn't just emotional. It was official, recognized, recorded, and enforceable. And while the people around me were debating whether I had overreacted or misunderstood the situation, the reality was much simpler and much more final. I hadn't just been pushed out of a house. I had been written out of a family in a way that couldn't be undone by a conversation or an apology. And once that kind of decision is made, it doesn't just affect where you live, it affects how the world sees you, how systems respond to you, and how you understand your own place in everything that comes next. Because from that point on, I wasn't just someone who had left home, I was someone who had been formally given away. And that distinction would follow me long after the story they told about me had faded. That night stretched longer than anything I had experienced before. Not because of the hours themselves, but because of what they represented. I sat on the front porch with those 2 garbage bags beside me. The same porch I had walked across every day without thinking. And suddenly, it felt like a place I was no longer allowed to belong to. The door behind me closed, the light inside still on. Shadows moving occasionally past the window. Reminders that life inside the house was continuing, as if nothing had changed. At first, I told myself this was temporary, that someone would come back, that my mother would open the door and say it had gone too far, that my father would step outside and try to fix it, that my sister would at least come down and say something, anything, to acknowledge what was happening, and I waited for that moment, holding on to it, because it was easier than accepting the alternative. But as the minutes turned into an hour, and then into 2, the silence didn't break. No footsteps approached the door, no voices called out, and the absence of any reaction began to feel heavier than anything they could have said. The temperature dropped as the night went on, the air turning colder, the kind that settles into your clothes and stays there, and I pulled my arms around myself, not just to stay warm, but to hold on to something. because the longer I sat there, the more unreal it felt, like I was watching something happen instead of living it, like at any moment someone would interrupt it and explain that it had all been a misunderstanding. But that moment never came. 4 hours passed that way. 4 hours of waiting for something that never happened. And at some point, without deciding to, I stopped expecting the door to open. That realization didn't come with anger or even sadness at first. It came with clarity, a quiet understanding that whatever connection I thought still existed between me and that house had already been cut, not just physically, but emotionally. And the fact that no one had come back for me, not once, not even to check, confirmed it in a way that words never could. When the headlights finally appeared at the end of the street, I didn't recognize them right away. They cut through the darkness slowly, turning into the driveway with a steady movement that didn't match the chaos I felt inside. And when the car stopped and the engine turned off, there was a brief moment of stillness before the door opened and someone stepped out, tall, familiar, in a way I hadn't expected to see that night. My Uncle Marcus didn't say anything at first. He walked up the path, looked at me, looked at the bags beside me, and for a second, there was something in his expression that I couldn't fully read. Not anger directed at me, not confusion, but something heavier, something that seemed to settle as he took in the situation without needing it explained. And then he reached out, placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and certain, and said, in a voice that didn't carry doubt or hesitation, "You have a home now." There was no question in it, no condition attached, just a statement. And in that moment, standing up from the porch, leaving behind the space I had spent hours waiting to be let back into, I realized that the night hadn't ended the way I expected, not with reconciliation, not with explanation, but with something else entirely. Something that didn't undo what had happened, but changed what would come next. Moving to a new city didn't feel like starting over at first. It felt like being dropped into a space where nothing connected to who I had been before. My Uncle Marcus's house was quieter than anything I was used to. Not tense or controlled, just steady. And that steadiness made it harder in a different way. Because without the constant pressure I had grown up with, I didn't know how to define myself. I didn't know what I was supposed to do when no one was telling me who to be or what to give up. The first few weeks passed in a kind of numb routine, enrolling in a new school, learning new schedules, trying to exist in classrooms where no one knew my history. And while that should have felt like freedom, it didn't, not immediately. Because the absence of judgment didn't replace the habits I had already formed. I still expected to be seen as a problem, still adjusted my behavior to avoid attention, still assumed that anything I wanted would eventually need to be sacrificed for something else. Trust was harder than anything else. Not just trusting people, but trusting situations, trusting that something offered to me wouldn't be taken away later, trusting that I wouldn't have to justify my place in every room I entered. And that lack of trust followed me into everything, into conversations, into opportunities, into decisions that should have been simple but felt uncertain because I had learned to expect conditions attached to everything. At some point, I realized that if I didn't create structure for myself, I would keep drifting. So I started focusing on what I could control. Not in a dramatic way, just in small, consistent steps, schoolwork, schedules, anything that allowed me to build something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval, and over time, that turned into something more intentional. I became interested in how money worked, how decisions affected outcomes, how systems were built and maintained, not because anyone told me to, but because it gave me a sense of stability, a way to understand the world in terms that were predictable. There was no formal training at first. No one sat me down and taught me how to manage finances or analyze situations. I learned by observing, by asking questions, by paying attention to how my uncle ran his business, how he made decisions, how he evaluated risk. And when I had the chance, I took on small tasks, organizing records, tracking numbers, anything that allowed me to be involved without overstepping. And each small step built on the last, creating a foundation that didn't exist before. At the same time, I worked. Not because I was told to, but because I needed to. Part-time jobs after school, weekends spent earning enough to cover what I could, and balancing that with classes wasn't easy. There were days when it felt like too much, when the idea of keeping everything moving seemed unrealistic. But stopping wasn't an option I considered, because for the first time, everything I built belonged to me, and that made it worth the effort. Still, there were moments when the weight of everything caught up. Moments when the distance from my past didn't feel like freedom, but like loss. I thought everything was over, not just the situation with my family, but the version of my life that had existed before, the identity I had built. Even if it had been shaped by limitations, it had still been something I recognized, and without it, I felt undefined in a way that was difficult to explain. It was during one of those moments that I learned something I hadn't known before. My uncle didn't bring it up immediately, but eventually, when paperwork needed to be updated for school and other records, he explained that the arrangement between us wasn't temporary. It had been made official. My parents had signed documents transferring full guardianship to him, not as a short-term solution, but as a permanent decision. And as he explained it, carefully, making sure I understood what it meant, I realized that this wasn't just about where I lived, it was about who I was legally connected to. I didn't have parents anymore, at least not in the way the system recognized. And hearing that didn't create a new feeling. It confirmed one that had already been there, something I had sensed the night I sat on that porch and no one came back, but now it had a different weight. Because it wasn't just emotional, it was real in a way that couldn't be reversed by time or intention. That realization could have broken me, but instead, it clarified something. If everything from before had been removed, then everything I built from that point forward would be mine, not given, not assigned, but created, step by step, in a way that no one could take back later. And that understanding didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the loss, but it gave me something else, a direction that didn't depend on where I had come from, only on where I was willing to go next. The shift didn't happen all at once. It built gradually, almost quietly, through the way my Uncle Marcus observed things I didn't realize he was paying attention to. He never asked direct questions about what I was doing or how I was thinking, but he noticed patterns, the way I tracked my expenses without being told, the way I organized my school schedule around work shifts without missing deadlines, the way I approached problems by breaking them down into smaller parts instead of reacting to them all at once. And over time, those small behaviors added up into something that stood out to him in a way I didn't fully understand at first. One evening, after I had finished helping him sort through some paperwork at the dining table, he asked me a simple question, not about school or how I was adjusting, but about a set of numbers we had been reviewing. He wanted to know why I thought one property performed differently from another, and at first, I hesitated, unsure if there was a correct answer he was expecting. But when I started explaining what I saw, how the timing of leases, maintenance costs, and location patterns interacted, he didn't interrupt, he didn't correct me, he just listened. And when I finished, he nodded once in a way that felt less like approval and more like recognition. After that, the questions changed. They became more frequent, more detailed, not in a way that felt like a test, but in a way that invited me to think further, to connect ideas, to explain not just what I saw, but why it mattered. And without realizing it, I began to engage with his work in a different way, not as something I was helping with occasionally, but as something I was starting to understand, something that made sense to me in a way that felt natural, structured, and clear. That was when he offered me something I hadn't expected. He told me that if I was willing, I could start spending time at his office after school, not just observing, but learning, starting with small tasks and building from there. An internship in his real estate company, not as a favor, but as an opportunity, something I would need to show up for, commit to, and take seriously. And the way he presented it made the difference clear. This wasn't something being given to me because I needed help. It was something being offered because he believed I could handle it. Walking into that office for the first time didn't feel like stepping into a new environment. It felt like entering a system that I could learn, understand, and eventually contribute to. The work started small, organizing files, updating spreadsheets, handling basic administrative tasks, but even those responsibilities carried weight because they were part of something larger, something that functioned based on accuracy, consistency, and attention to detail. And as I worked through them, I began to see how everything connected, how decisions affected outcomes, how small errors could create larger consequences if they weren't caught early. What surprised me most wasn't that I could do it, it was how quickly it started to make sense, how the discipline I had developed out of necessity translated into something valuable in this environment, how the need to be independent, to manage things on my own, became an advantage instead of a limitation. And as the weeks turned into months, the tasks became more complex, the expectations higher, and with each step, I realized that this wasn't just an opportunity to learn. It was a foundation for something much bigger than I had allowed myself to consider before. For the first time, the way I thought, the way I worked, the way I approached problems wasn't being minimized or redirected. It was being used, built on, expanded, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed how I saw everything that came next, because it meant that what I had developed on my own, without support, without recognition, actually had value in a way that extended beyond survival. It could become something that defined my future. The years that followed didn't feel dramatic from the inside. There was no single moment where everything suddenly changed. Instead, it was a steady progression built on repetition, on showing up every day and doing the work without expecting immediate recognition. I moved from small tasks to larger responsibilities gradually, learning how to read financial statements, how to evaluate property performance, how to understand cash flow not just as numbers on a page, but as something that reflected real decisions, real risks, real outcomes. And the more I learned, the more I realized how much of it depended on consistency rather than talent, on discipline rather than quick success. Balancing school and work became my normal. Long days that started early and ended late, moving between classrooms and the office, carrying the same focus into both spaces, because I knew that neither could be neglected if I wanted to keep building forward, and over time, that effort started to compound, not in obvious ways at first, but in small shifts that became noticeable only when I looked back. I began to anticipate problems before they happened, to see patterns in numbers that others missed, to make decisions that reflected not just what was happening now, but what could happen next. My uncle didn't rush the process. He didn't move me forward faster than I was ready, but he also didn't hold me back. When I showed that I could handle more, he gave me more. Responsibilities that required judgment, not just execution. Opportunities to sit in on meetings, to understand how deals were structured, how negotiations unfolded, how long-term value was built through careful planning rather than short-term gains. And with each step, the distance between where I started and where I was going became clearer. By the time I finished college, I wasn't just someone who had studied finance. I was someone who had been working inside it for years, and that difference mattered. It meant I didn't need to start from zero the way most people did. I had already built a foundation that could support the next level, and when I moved into a full-time role, the transition felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation. The title came later than the work itself. At 26, when I was named Chief Financial Officer, it wasn't announced with anything dramatic, no major celebration, just a formal acknowledgement of what had already been happening. I had been operating at that level long before the title was assigned, managing a portfolio valued at over $25 million, overseeing properties, tracking performance, making decisions that affected the direction of the company. And when I stepped into that role officially, it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like alignment. Like everything I had been building had finally been recognized for what it was. What made it different was not just the position, but the clarity that came with it. I knew exactly how I had gotten there. Not through shortcuts, not through someone else's expectations, but through a process I had controlled, step by step, and that understanding made the result feel stable in a way that couldn't be taken away easily. Meanwhile, my past existed in a completely separate space. There had been no contact, no updates, no attempts to reconnect, and over time, that silence turned into assumption. The people I had left behind didn't know what I was doing, didn't track the progress, didn't see the changes, and in the absence of information, they filled the gap with something simpler, something that fit the narrative they had already created. That I had disappeared, that I had failed, that whatever path I had taken hadn't led anywhere meaningful. No one corrected them. No one challenged that assumption. Because no one from that part of my life was close enough to see what was actually happening. And in a way, that separation became an advantage. It meant I could build without interference, without being pulled back into the expectations that had once defined me. And as the company grew, as the portfolio expanded, as my role became more established, I realized that everything I had created existed independently of what they believed about me, and that independence was something I had never truly had before. They thought I had disappeared. They had no idea I had been building something they would eventually come looking for. The will reading was scheduled on the 47th floor of a glass office tower overlooking the city, the kind of place designed to feel neutral and controlled, where decisions were documented rather than argued, and I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted to understand the room before anything began. The long table already set, documents arranged neatly, the attorney reviewing final notes with a level of calm that suggested this was routine for her, even if it wasn't for anyone else involved. I took my seat near the center, not at the head of the table, but in a position where I could see everything clearly, the windows stretching behind me, reflecting a skyline that had become familiar over the years, and for a moment, everything felt structured, predictable, another formal step in a process that I understood well enough to move through without hesitation until the elevator doors opened. I noticed them before anyone said their names. 3 figures stepping out with a kind of confidence that didn't match the setting. My parents and my sister walking toward the conference room as if they already belonged there, and behind them, a man in a tailored suit carrying a leather briefcase, moving with the precision of someone who had done this many times before, their attorney. And as they entered the room, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Not loud, not disruptive, but undeniable. Because their presence didn't just add people to the space, it brought a version of the past into a place where it hadn't existed until that moment. My mother was the first to speak, her tone controlled, almost formal, as if we were meeting under normal circumstances, acknowledging the situation in a way that suggested she had already decided how it would unfold. And when she took her seat along the side of the room, not at the table but close enough to observe, It became clear that she hadn't come to reconnect. She had come with a purpose, and that purpose wasn't subtle. Their attorney introduced himself shortly after, outlining their position in clear, measured language, stating that they intended to challenge the distribution of the estate, that they believed there were grounds to claim a significant portion, and when he specified the number, approximately 50%, an amount that translated to nearly $12 million, the room remained quiet, not because it was expected, but because it was structured in a way that didn't invite immediate reaction. The reasoning came next. They argued that I had influenced my uncle during the final months of his life, that my position within the company had given me access and control, that the decisions reflected in the will were not entirely independent, and as the words were spoken, I didn't interrupt, not because I agreed, but because I understood the strategy. It wasn't about proving something immediately. It was about placing doubt into the record, creating a narrative that could be expanded later if needed. I looked at them, really looked this time, and what stood out wasn't anger or confrontation, it was certainty, the assumption that this would work, that the structure of the system would shift in their favor the way it had before, that they could step into a situation they had abandoned years ago and still claim authority over it. And in that moment, I realized something that made everything else clearer. They hadn't come to ask. They had come to take. And as the attorney finished outlining their position, as the documents were placed on the table and the process prepared to move forward, the weight of what was about to happen settled into place, not as something uncertain, but as something inevitable. They thought they were walking in to claim everything. The attorney representing the estate did not react immediately to their claims. She listened through the entire presentation without interruption, taking a few notes, allowing their argument to be fully stated before responding. And when she finally spoke, her tone remained steady, professional, not dismissive, but precise in a way that suggested she was not addressing a debate. She was clarifying a record. She opened a folder that had already been prepared before the meeting began, sliding a set of documents across the table toward the center where everyone could see them, and without raising her voice, she began to read, not summarizing, not interpreting, but quoting directly from the legal filings. They relinquished all parental rights in 2010, she said. Each word measured and clear. This document was executed, witnessed, and filed with the court, transferring full guardianship and legal responsibility. And as she spoke, the room shifted. Not dramatically, but in a way that could be felt, as if the assumptions that had entered with my parents were beginning to lose their structure. She paused briefly, allowing the statement to settle before continuing. They have no legal standing to contest this estate. And the effect of that sentence was immediate. Not because it was loud, but because it removed the foundation of everything that had just been presented, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence filling the space where their argument had been, leaving nothing in its place. My mother stood up so quickly that her chair shifted back against the floor, the movement sharp against the stillness of the room, her voice rising as she tried to respond, to question the validity of what had just been read. But the attorney didn't engage in the emotion of it. She simply directed attention back to the documents, indicating the signatures, the dates, the official seal that confirmed the filing, each detail reinforcing the same point from a different angle. My father reacted differently, not with volume, but with tension, his posture tightening, his expression shifting from controlled to unsettled as he processed what was being presented. Because unlike a narrative that could be argued or reframed, this was something fixed, something recorded, something that existed independently of what anyone in the room wanted it to be. The attorney continued, turning to the next page. Under the terms of the will and the legal adoption that followed, she is the sole legal heir. And this time, the words carried a different weight. not just removing their claim, but establishing mine in a way that was complete and final. And as she finished reading, the documents were passed along the table, reviewed by the additional counsel present, each person confirming the same details, the same signatures, the same legal standing. There was no gap in the process, no missing piece that could be questioned. The court records were clear, the notarized documents verified, the adoption legally recognized and enforceable, and each layer of validation added to the same conclusion, not through argument, but through structure, through the system that defined how these decisions were made and upheld. What had been presented wasn't open to interpretation. It didn't rely on opinion or persuasion. It existed as fact. And in that space, there was nothing left for them to claim, because the authority they had assumed they still held had already been removed years earlier, formalized in a way that couldn't be reversed by their presence in that room or by the argument they had brought with them. The shift in the room was immediate after the documents were confirmed, not loud or chaotic, but unmistakable. The structure that my parents had relied on when they walked in had collapsed in a matter of minutes, and for the first time since they entered, there was no clear direction for them to move in, no argument left to expand, no position left to defend, only the reality of what had just been established in front of multiple witnesses. My mother was the first to react, but not in the way she had prepared for. The controlled tone she had maintained at the beginning of the meeting was gone, replaced by something unsteady, her words no longer structured as a legal argument but as an appeal, shifting quickly from challenging the documents to questioning how this could have happened, how something like this could exist without her understanding it. And then, almost without transition, her focus turned to me, her voice softening, asking questions that weren't meant for the room but for me directly, as if the situation could be changed through recognition alone, as if acknowledging me now might reopen something that had already been closed. It didn't. Because what she was asking for in that moment wasn't clarification, it was reversal, and there was no mechanism in place for that, not in the legal sense, not in the structure that had just been confirmed. And as she continued, the shift became more visible. The confidence that had carried her into the room replaced by something closer to urgency, to the realization that the outcome she had expected was no longer possible, and that the only path left was one that depended on something she no longer controlled. My father didn't follow the same path. He didn't raise his voice or attempt to redirect the conversation. He remained seated, his posture rigid, his attention fixed on the documents in front of him, reading them again as if repetition might reveal something different. But the more he looked, the clearer it became that there was nothing to reinterpret. And in that stillness, something else became apparent. The authority he had once carried into every decision, every interaction, was no longer present, not because it had been taken from him in that moment, but because it had been removed years earlier, formalized in a way he could not undo. The room didn't move to accommodate them. The process continued. The estate attorney proceeded with the reading, the structure of the meeting unchanged, and in that continuity, their collapse became more defined, not through confrontation, but through the absence of influence, the realization that their presence no longer shaped the outcome in any way. Then another detail surfaced, not as part of their argument, but as part of the review process. One of the senior attorneys present requested clarification regarding representation, noting a potential overlap in prior legal work, and as the discussion unfolded, it became clear that the attorney representing my parents had previously been associated with my uncle's firm in a limited capacity, a connection that hadn't been disclosed when he took their case. The room shifted again, but this time in a different direction. Questions were raised, not about the estate, but about professional conduct, about whether there was a conflict of interest that should have been addressed before representation began. And as those questions were examined, the situation moved beyond the scope of the will reading, entering a space governed by professional standards rather than personal claims. The attorney attempted to respond, to explain the nature of the prior involvement, but the explanation didn't resolve the concern, because the issue wasn't just whether the connection existed, it was whether it had been properly disclosed, and whether it affected the integrity of the representation, and within that framework, the outcome was clear enough to require further action. The matter was formally noted. Procedures were initiated. And while the full consequences would unfold outside that room, the immediate effect was already visible. The confidence that had supported their legal challenge was now undermined from within, not by anything I had said or done, but by the structure of the system they had chosen to rely on. In the span of a single meeting, everything they had brought with them had unraveled, not through confrontation, not through escalation, but through clarity, through documentation, through the quiet but definitive weight of decisions that had been made long before they arrived and could not be changed now. When the meeting finally concluded and the documents were gathered, the room didn't empty immediately. People moved slowly, some reviewing notes, others speaking quietly in small groups. But the tension that had filled the space earlier had already settled into something else, something more final, and I remained where I was for a moment, not because I had anything left to say, but because I wanted to be certain that whatever I did next came from clarity, not reaction. I could feel them before they reached me, the shift in the air, the hesitation in their steps, my mother approaching first, no longer composed in the way she had been when she walked in, her voice softer now, careful, as if every word needed to be chosen differently than before. She said my name in a way that sounded unfamiliar, like she was trying to reconnect it to something that had been lost. And for a brief second, I saw the possibility of what she wanted. Not a legal reversal, but a personal one, a chance to step back into something that had already been closed. My father stood just behind her, silent, his presence no longer carrying the authority it once had, and my sister remained a few steps away, not speaking, not meeting my eyes, as if the space between us had become too defined to cross, and in that moment, there was no argument, no accusation, just a quiet recognition of what had been established, not only in the documents on the table, but in everything that had happened leading up to this point. My mother began to speak again, trying to explain, not in legal terms this time, but in personal ones, saying that things had been difficult back then, that decisions had been made under pressure, that they hadn't understood the consequences, and I listened, not because I needed the explanation, but because I wanted to hear it fully, without interruption, without reacting, and when she finished, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was clear. I looked at them, all three of them, and for the first time, I wasn't trying to fit into the version of myself they had created. I wasn't trying to defend or prove anything. I was simply deciding what came next based on what I knew, and when I spoke, my voice didn't need to be strong to carry weight. It just needed to be certain. "I forgave you," I said, allowing the words to settle before continuing, "but you don't get access to my life anymore." There was no hesitation in it, no room for negotiation. Because forgiveness, for me, wasn't about reopening the past, it was about releasing it, about removing the hold it had on my decisions, and what remained after that release was something simpler, a boundary that didn't require explanation or approval, just recognition. No one argued. No one tried to change my mind. Because the meaning was already clear. The connection they were trying to reach no longer existed in the way they remembered it, and as I stepped away from the table, leaving the room without looking back, it didn't feel like walking away from something unfinished. It felt like moving forward from something that had already been resolved in every way that mattered. For a long time, I thought being left behind meant I had lost something permanent, something that defined my value in a way I couldn't change. I believed that when people walked away from you, it said something about who you were, something that stayed with you no matter how far you went. But standing there, at the end of everything, after the documents, after the silence, after the truth had been made clear in a room that left no space for denial, I understood something that changed the way I saw all of it. You don't lose your worth when people walk away. You lose it when you keep chasing them. They signed me away like I didn't matter, like my place in their lives could be reduced to a line on a document, something final, something easy, something that didn't require reflection or reconsideration. And for years, I carried that with me, not as anger, but as a question, trying to understand what it meant, trying to figure out where I fit in a world that had removed me so completely. But somewhere along the way, without making a single dramatic decision, that question stopped guiding me. I stopped looking back for answers that weren't there, and I started building something that didn't depend on their recognition. So I built a life where their signatures meant nothing. If you were in my position, would you have shared what you built with the people who walked away when it mattered most? Would you have chosen to bring them back into your life because of where they started with you? Or would you have drawn a line and protected everything you created on your own? Would you choose justice even if it meant letting go of family? Or would you choose to forgive and rebuild something from what's left? I want to know what you would do, because these choices don't have simple answers. They reflect what matters most to you. So tell me, would you share or walk away? Comment yes if you would forgive and share, or no if you would cut them off completely.